good afternoon or good day, wherever you are on our beautiful, glorious planet. And I am Sandy Schoelles and my partner Jennifer Hynes, and we are Environmental Coffee House. We have our guest today is the esteemed Michael Dowd, who is a speaker and an author, and whose latest endeavor had been the Post-Doom series, where he interviewed fabulous, amazing people. Michael, welcome to Environmental Coffee House with us.
Thanks, Sandy. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. This is great.
Well,
we're so pleased to have you.
Yeah, I thought Jennifer might want to get started on this since she's been interviewed by you.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, sure. I can't say enough good things about Michael, and he has really been grappling with our predicament, as I would call it. And Michael, I was wondering if you could tell me something about some big turning points in your life that brought you to this very kind of unusual and profound mission that grapples with the predicament that we find ourselves here on Earth right now.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I've been thinking of how would I describe what I do or what my purpose or mission is in a short form. And I think that I'm a post-doom pastor or post-doom chaplain or post-doom shaman of the TEOTWAWKI tribe, you know, the end of the world as we know it, or the post-doom pastor of the TEOTWAWKI flock or something. And really what I'm trying to do these days is to help people see the big picture, to accept what's real, what's inescapably real, what's undeniably real, move through whatever feelings they're going to have, which they're going to have, because we all grew up in an age of exuberance and an age of carrying capacity surplus, and where expectations of things getting better was there for most of us, sort of the invisible religion of perpetual progress. And then that shifted in our lifetime, and now we're in a time of contraction, a time of tightening of in-group, a time of abrupt climate destabilization, and a time of political and economic craziness that makes total sense when you understand the rise and fall, boom and bust of civilizations, but is terribly confusing if you don't understand that and if you don't have an ecological worldview. So what I'm trying to do is help people fairly quickly understand boom and bust, progress, regress civilizations, and why every human-centered civilization in history has self-destructed, creating ecocide. What is it about the ecological worldview that allows us to look at the predicament and the chaos and the stupidity and the craziness of our times from a place of, oh, of course. So replacing confusion with clarity, which then tends to open up the heart so people can start having compassion. The blame game starts to evaporate for them, because when you have this understanding, this deep time historical ecological understanding, you just find yourself feeling compassion where you used to have blame and judgment and confusion and anger and all that stuff. So much of my work is helping people to have that worldview shift and then find the places where they can be a blessing to their community, to their neighbors, to their friends. It's usually local. I call it love and action, not activism as such, but love and action. What does love motivate you to do? And at the scale where it can actually be a blessing to the people that you're doing it with. So that's what I find, and that's the whole post-doom conversation series. The subtitle is Regenerative Conversations, Exploring Overshoot, Grief, Grounding, and Gratitude. And that emerged out of a conversation with Paul Beckwith and Paul Czafurka up in Canada. Connie and I had a conversation for several hours with them, and we floated this idea of a post-doom conversation series, and they were like, wow, that sounds great. And it came out of really Connie writing an email my wife was just featured in a acclaimed book called The Journeys of Trees by Zach St. George. And it features Connie, my wife, from the very first sentence. She's the lead character throughout this book. So here we were in Ottawa, Canada, about to have the next day with Paul Czafurka and Paul Beckwith. And Connie sent this email to this author, and she said, yeah, we just finished doing a retreat for about 80 ministers, liberal Christian ministers and Unitarian Universalists. And, you know, we gave them a lot of doom, but there's only so much doom you can give, you know, ministers, because they got to be in the pulpit and share with their congregation. So she said, pretty quickly, we got to a post-doom place. And she said, you know, post-doom has a gorgeous sunrise, period. End of email. And she reads this to me, and I'm like, post-doom? Post-doom has a gorgeous sunrise? That is kick butt. And that was the birth of this thing. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Jennifer was actually one of the first, or I think you were like number 2 or number 3 in terms of the first ones that Connie edited and we put up because of your immersion in understanding abrupt climate change and methane and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I was so honored that you had asked me to be on that series. And it's a significant series, Michael. There are about 75 separate interviews, I believe, that you've conducted at last count.
And they're not just interviews. The interesting thing is they're really conversations because it's not like me. It's kind of like the two of you with me. You're colleagues. You're not just interviewers. The two of you are knowledgeable colleagues in this field. And to have these 75 conversations where we sometimes spiral each other to places that neither one of us thought we were going to go, that is priceless in my world.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it takes you to different places, unexpected places. And I just want to read a couple of little things about what post-doom is. It's what opens up when we remember who we are, when we accept the inevitable, honor our grief, and prioritize what is pro-future and soul-nourishing. So we're all, by the thousands and millions, coming to this kind of meltdown, catharsis, this realization that we are in some deep doo-doo here, ecologically on our planet. And what do you do after you have your mental breakdown and, just cry into your pillow and all that? Exactly. There's life on the other side. So these post-doom conversations take us to where people go when they contend with this and they embrace the life on the other side. So it's a fierce and fearless reverence for life and relative equanimity in the face of abrupt climate change and now a global pandemic.
Yes. And
it's how to live meaningfully, compassionately, and courageously, no matter what.
Yes, amen. And that definition of post-doom wasn't just something that I pulled out of my butt. Basically, I floated with colleagues for several months, various possible definitions of doom and various possible definitions of post-doom, and sort of honed in on some collective intelligence in terms of the 3 definitions of doom on that website, the postdoom.com website, and the 3 definitions of post-doom. But thank you for reading those. I really appreciate that.
So, Michael, what are you doing these days? Are you continuing with the post-doom conversations, or is your adventure taking you somewhere else now?
That's a great question. And what I'm realizing is I didn't even answer your first question, so I'll cycle back around to that in terms of the 2 major turning points in my life that got me to this place. But first, yes, throughout 2021, really what I hope to do is do 2 things. One is make the post-doom conversation series more accessible. 75 conversations. Who the hell has time for 75 conversations? And so if there's a minister or just a neighbor, somebody who wants to invite on Zoom, their family members or their neighbors or their church members or synagogue, whatever, to a conversation around these topics, how do they choose among the 75? Like, which were the ones that so I want to create some kind of a leader facilitator guide or a sort of discussion guide that helps people to discern, okay, if I have time for 12 or 8 conversations or 6, which are the ones that would be most useful to the people that I'll be having in this conversation series? And then topical index so that, people can see, this conversation with Joanna Macy, they cover these topics. This one with Bijan Bendel covers these topics. This one with, whoever. So that to make it more accessible to people than simply having 75 YouTube videos. The other is to create, and this I hope to do actually in the next 2 weeks, is to finish the audio introductions so that all 75 of these can also be made available purely in audio form so that people could download it to their iPod or whatever. So to have it be available not just in YouTube, but also on SoundCloud or, iTunes or, whatever. So that's one thing. The other is that I've been in the process of trying to take the last 8 years, where I've spent between 20 and 50 hours a week for the last 8 years, passionately studying this stuff. I mean, I'm an independent scholar. This is just what I do. And the fact that we've lived on the road for the last 18 and a half years, and now we're settled in Ypsilanti, Michigan, but we've been living in other people's second homes and vacation homes, which gives me a lot of time because, even though I'm speaking, once or twice or 3 times a week, I was back prior to COVID, I got tons of time. So I've been able to study and read a lot of books, and I've recorded, a couple of dozen books on audio, and they're all freely available on SoundCloud. And I've been trying to take this, what I've been studying for the last 8 years, and make it really accessible, like in a short form, like 3.5 hours. For example, I created a 3-part primer, I call post-doom primer, a collapse and adaptation primer. And each of them is about an hour to an hour and 10 minutes long. Collapse 101, The Inevitable Fruit of Progress is the first one. And then post-gloom, Deeply Adapting to Reality, that's the more practical one, having to do with evolutionary psychology and brain science, and also really helpful tools and helping people move through the grief and that sort of thing. And then the last one is Sustainability 101. Indigenuity is not optional. And what I mean by that is an indigenous heart and mind is the only thing that evolution has shown us by selection is sustainable, genuinely sustainable. So how do we nurture and plant seeds so that if any human beings survive this bottleneck, which we may not, but we may, we can know pretty certainly that the only forms of humanity that will continue into the future are those that represent indigenuity, that is an indigenous heart and mind into applying it and problem solving and that sort of thing. So those 3 videos, I thought I was done. And we moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan, and we're living 2 blocks from my now 9-month-old granddaughter. And I spend a couple of hours a day over there, 5 days a week, just caring for my granddaughter, which is bliss because when the world's going to hell in a handbasket and you're just, the political craziness and everything else, everything evaporates. I'm just in the present moment with this incredible divine being. So that's awesome. But I thought I was done. And then I kept hearing over and over again in every kind of setting, people talking about, will collapse happen? When will it happen? What do you think is going to be? And it's all about the future. And having studied ecology, and I understand ecological collapse, which is a decades-long, sometimes century or more process, and then civilizational collapse, which is usually a couple of centuries, and it's also in decline, and then there's the exponential drop-off the last decades. That's when I realized, I'm not quite done yet. And so I created a video at the end of December called Irreversible Collapse, and then got some feedback on that, and about a week and a half later created a second version, which is 95% the same, called Unstoppable Collapse, How to Avoid the Worst. And it seems to me that there are 3 things that we need to do to avoid being evil on a geological timescale. One is capping the nukes, preventing to ensure as few nuclear meltdowns and as little unnecessary toxicity that can last millions of years into the future. So that's one, is lessening, doing whatever we can in the coming decade, if we have that long, but doing whatever we can to ensure as few nuclear meltdowns and as little unnecessary excruciating toxicity for the body of life, even if we go extinct, that we don't want to do that. So that's one. The second is to move trees, what this book, The Journeys of Trees, is all about, that features my wife's work, assisted migration, or as the indigenous people say, helping forests walk. So this assisting the green world in moving faster than any other animal can move them. The truth of the matter is the difference between thousands of species of shrubs, plants, and trees going extinct this century and those same thousands of species of shrubs, plants, and trees surviving this century entirely, 100% depends on humans helping them move. So that's holy work, even if we go extinct. And then the last is just investing in regenerative things, doing anything we can to participate in the regenerative healing, self-healing properties of Earth. So that seems to me holy work, even if we go extinct in the next decade, which is certainly a possibility.
I think those are beautiful.
Well, this is, Absolutely beautiful. Well, these are all things, humanity and the better part of human beings coming forward to give nature an assist, to stamp down the nukes, cap them off, to help the trees, and to help with regeneration in general. So all of these are appealing to our higher nature as human beings.
Yes.
And do you
they're
think
all
that
ecocentric.
Yeah. Do you think that there might be en masse an evolutionary process going on with humankind? And do you think that we will en masse discover our higher nature and be inspired to activism? Do you think that's possible?
No, I don't. I did. I honestly did. And in fact, from about 2012 to 2015, until I read William Catton's book, Overshoot, the ecological basis of revolutionary change. When I read this, that understanding that you just articulated just evaporated for me in a good way. But I do think we're seeing in small pockets people having a deep ecological awakening that's also profoundly spiritual, but then they just want to give their lives to being of service to their community and being of service to the future from that place of fearless love. But I don't see millions or billions of people having some kind of an awakening that allows us to transform our structures or systems. I just honestly don't see that happening. In fact, I don't.
I don't see that happening either. And I think this is a good segue into asking you about a bullet point on your website about human-centered technology and the market are false gods creating hell on earth. And you just illustrated a way where we don't have to live hell on earth.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sandy. Yeah, it's interesting. Again, because we all, or not we all, I don't want to assume, but, any of us who are in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, or 80s, we grew up, certainly those 40 and above, grew up in a world of perceived carrying capacity surplus, where there was more than enough energy, more than enough resources. Liberal values predominated. That's what happens in expanding times. And then that shifted in our lifetime to where we're now in carrying capacity deficit. There's not enough energy, not enough resources. In-groups are tightening. And that's what always happens in every previous collapsed civilization that we know of. And we have dozens of examples. We see conservative values predominate. In-groups tighten up. People get more stingy rather than more generous. As a general rule, obviously there are exceptions, because this is also a time when saints, sages, heroes and sheroes are born, people who genuinely are serving something larger than themselves in a heroic way. And they, that's extraordinary. Many people, most of us, I certainly, from 2000 to 2012, I want to cycle back to Jennifer's first question, because the two major conversion experiences that I've had in my life, well, really three, I guess. The first one would have been 1979, when I was struggling with drug and alcohol and sexual stuff. And then I had a mountaintop experience that was hashish induced. And then had this epiphany of my life and my death. And it's like, I had this vision of like, okay, even if I die at the age of 100, what was my life committed to? And, most 21-year-olds don't really think about their legacy. And I couldn't not think about my legacy from that moment on. So that's when the next week I went to church, this woman in an Assemblies of God church, and I had a born again conversion experience. And I was involved in Pentecostal charismatic Christianity for a number of years, for 3 or 4 years, went to an Assemblies of God college, majored in biblical studies and philosophy. So that was a first big turning point. The second one, which was actually way more profound ultimately in terms of where I am now, was in 1988, February 1st of 1988, which was when I was introduced to Thomas Berry. I had been familiar with Joanna Macy and several other deep ecology folks and bioregional permaculture, ecofeminist stuff. But in 1988, Thomas Berry, I was introduced to him, and he was, well known for the whole universe story, the epic of evolution, physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution, as our first and only globally produced evidence-based creation story. And he was a Catholic cultural historian. He was a monk, but he was one of the most significant ecological thinkers and evolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. And I went from being a supernaturalist to being a religious naturalist pretty much overnight in early 1988. I sort of began interpreting all religious mythic language as saying something metaphorical, something symbolic about this one reality in which we live and move and have our being. And so I became a religious naturalist then. So that was a huge turning point. And then I went on to become, I did the same thing as I've been doing the last 8 years around collapse and stuff like that. I ended up spending 20 to 50 hours a week studying the universe story and ecology and evolution and all this kind of stuff, and started doing workshops and everything else. My first book was Earth Spirit, a handbook on nurturing an ecological Christianity. And it was published in 1990. I dedicated it to my daughter, Miriam, who now lives, she's 30 years old. She lives 2 blocks away, and now I care for her daughter. And I dedicated that book to Miriam. I dedicated it to Miriam Joy and to her grandchildren. I honestly don't think there's likely to be grandchildren for her because of abrupt climate change. And the other really big turning point was December 3rd of 2012. I woke up early in the morning. I read this article, 5 climate charts that should have you really, really scared. And it was, I think, in the Atlantic, and it was a chart and a paragraph, and at the end there was this TEDx talk by David Roberts called "Climate Change is Simple." And it was a remix. So Ryan Cooper had added some music. And I watched that and I was bawling. And I woke Connie up, because this was like 7 o'clock in the morning. I woke her up. We both watched it. We both were in tears. That afternoon, I bought a half a dozen books on climate. And that's really when my techno-optimism died that day. So those were the 3 big turning points in my life that has led to where I'm at now in terms of promoting this post-doom perspective.
There's been so many transformations that you've gone through, because I think when you initially, back in the late 70s, I guess it was 77 or something like that, you were actually a charismatic, what do they call it? Creationist, short.
Yeah, exactly.
Short history.
Right. Yeah. Young Earth creationist. Right. Exactly.
Young Earth. That's what it is.
Right.
You see,
from 1979 until 1982, I was a young Earth creationist. I was anti-evolution. I believed that Jesus was coming back any day. We'd probably never see the year 2000. I read the Bible straight through twice. I mean, as you can tell, I'm a pretty passionate guy. And so when I get into something, I study it voraciously. I read incessantly, and I want to become the best in the world in whatever that topic happens to be, or certainly one of the more knowledgeable people on that topic. But yeah, it really shifted at Evangel College in Springfield, Missouri, was where I embraced evolution, and I embraced evolution in a holy, sacred, meaningful way. And that's when I also began shifting away from anthropocentrism, human-centeredness, to life-centeredness, ecocentrism. Okay. And now I consider myself an eco-theologian.
And that's when you wrote in 2009, Thank God for Evolution. And this is the book that was endorsed by 6 Nobel Prize winning scientists and skeptics, and also by religious leaders. So you really have a very, very broad appeal, which is quite amazing.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. Part of that is because simply having experience. I mean, when you've spoken to somewhere between 27 and 2,900 groups over close to 2 decades, and they're radically different groups. So I speak to groups of atheists, humanists, free thinkers all the time. I speak to groups of Christians, Catholic, Protestant, liberal, conservative. All the evils of the world can be attributed to Darwin. They don't invite me to speak, obviously. But others do. And then also I've spoken hundreds of times to New Thought, New Age, Integral, Hindu, Buddhist, other kinds of groups. And so I've been forced by life's conditions, because there was 2.5 years where Connie and I asked for feedback, radically honest feedback. We said, please give it anonymously. Just let us know really honestly what worked for you, what didn't work for you, any language that I used that was off-putting. And I got a chance to hone things so that, I don't know, about 10 years ago, I did a program at the United Nations called, and I did it there. And it was a small group. It wasn't the whole United Nations. It was a values caucus. But Michael Shermer, who's the editor and the founder of Skeptic Magazine, I sent him an audio and he said, wow, that's exactly. I'd love you to do that same program using the same slides at Caltech for a group of about 350 humanists and atheists. I was like, cool. Okay. So I did it there. And then 1 week later, I gave the exact same program with the exact same slides at Michael Beckwith's Agape Spiritual Life, which is this like New Age mecca. And then 2 weeks later at a Catholic church, and a week after that at an evangelical church. Now, evangelicals, Catholics, atheists, and New Agers are 4 totally different populations, and yet the same exact slides delivered the exact same way, or virtually the same way, worked for all of them. And that was largely because of the brutally honest feedback that I had received for several years earlier on my programs from very different audiences.
That's great. Feedback is, as a former HR professional, feedback is critical, and
truly,
in order to go on and be successful as you have.
It's also the only way to evolve.
Yeah,
the only way to grow.
And sometimes it hurts, but it's okay because it's a growth hurt. You get over it and you say, okay, I can do that. I can change. And that's what I used to impart on people that I was training at the time. So I do have one question here, and it's sticking in my mind, the term techno-optimist. Could you tell us what you feel is a techno-optimist at this time?
Yeah, and I'm grateful for the question because it reminded me of what you said before that I didn't fully respond to, which is that we who grew up in the 20th century with this sense of never-ending progress, everlasting progress, it was sort of an invisible religion or a secular religion, secular faith in progress. We naturally assume that technology in the market can solve things, and yet what we don't realize unless you step back and look at the history of technology, like all technologies from fire and, spears and bows and arrows, like the history of technology, then you realize that every human-centered technology that benefited us but didn't benefit the body of life upon which we depend ended up causing more problems than they solved. They just did it over time. And now it's happening in spades because we've got industrial-powered, fossil fuel-powered technology. And the market, the only sustainable way of being in the history of our species is treating the living world as a greater thou, not a lesser it. You can't, Joanna Macy, her book from 30 years ago was titled World as Lover, World as Self. I had a conversation with Joanna just offline, not an official conversation, because I've known her for 40 years, I guess. But at any rate, she mentioned that the 30th anniversary edition of that's coming out. World as lover, world as self. That is precisely the indigenous mindset. That's precisely a sustainable pro-future mindset because it's treating primary reality, that is everything we depend upon, as a love, as a greater thou, as the goddess, as Gaia, as God, whatever the name was, but it gives us humility before that reality, and then we preserve the well-being of that for our own benefit. We've been treating industrialization and mechanization has been treating the world not as lover, not as self, but as larder and toilet, a place of resources and a place for our waste, the source of resources. So technology in the market can't solve problems that are caused by technology in the market in the first place, because market economies, every market economy in the history of our species, and there have been a number of them, not exactly like recent, but money-based economies that treat the land as commodity rather than as divine being, basically, ends up doing exactly that. It ends up destroying the foundations. They go into overshoot and collapse because they treat the air, water, soil, and life upon which they depend as less important than them and their social structures. And you can't do that. Ecocentrism, life-centeredness is the only thing that's sustainable. So techno-optimism is when you put your faith, it's really a religious faith, in technology to solve the problems caused by technology. And a lot of techno-optimists don't understand that. But also they think that that's going to allow us to have 7 billion people in a world where the biosphere has been collapsing actually for 2.5 centuries, but it's been in free fall collapse for the last about 40 or 50 years.
Yep. Bingo. Very good. I mean, you nailed it for me. And the eco-modernists, there's so many terms and so many names. The eco-modernists too. I think it's a similar a similar genre.
It's a similar delusion. It's a similar delusion, but it's an understandable one. See, this is the thing. Yeah. It's a totally understandable one. When I interact with eco-modernists or techno-optimists or techno-utopians or whatever, and I usually don't judge and blame them, because we all grew up with this secular faith. And it's not easy to really accept that we are in decline. I mean, just when Connie and I took a walk just an hour and a half ago, what came to me is that if you can't perceive decline, you can't possibly understand our time, because we are in decline. We're not in expansion anymore, and things are contracting and collapsing. But if you don't understand collapse, not like the collapse of a building that happens all at once, but if you don't understand ecological contraction and collapse and civilizational contraction and collapse, then you're going to be confused. And if you don't understand overshoot, then you're going to misdiagnose and be confused about damn near everything. That's why I say Overshoot by William Catton is the single most important book I've ever read in my life. And I would encourage anybody watching or listening to this that if you only read one more book for the rest of your life, make it Catton's Overshoot. I promise you will be glad that you did.
I guess the books that you love the most, you've recorded them and made them available for people to listen to them.
Exactly. And part of that is, again, because I'm by nature a teacher, a pastor, or someone who wants to share whatever I've learned with others. And so when I read a book that changes my life or that it deeply enriches my worldview, and I talk to other colleagues and my God, they value it just as highly, then yeah, I usually record that. I let the authors and the publishers know I'm doing it, but I've never had them say no. In fact, several of them have said, I don't think you're actually legally supposed to be able to do that, but we sure appreciate the free advertising. Because I always say, if you like this book, if you like this audio recording, please support the publisher, support the author, buy a paperback copy. You're going to want to mark it up, I promise. And the nice thing about the unofficial part, where I'm recording the unofficial narrative, where I'm narrating in an unofficial way, is when I'm moved to tears, like, for example, in reading Catton's Overshoot. There's a couple of times where you can hear me, my voice starts cracking, and then at the end of the chapter, I'm in a full-blown sob, and you can hear Connie sobbing on the couch because she's listening, because we're moved by Catton's generosity of soul. So I can, and the other thing I do is that I say, after really great paragraphs, I say, now that paragraph was so good, I'm going to read it again. And it alerts the audio listener, like, hey, wake up out of your trance. This is important.
I think that sounds like a book, Jennifer, you and I should read and then discuss it on a show as a topic right there.
Yeah.
Anybody who reads Overshoot, if they're willing to have a conversation with me, public or private, it doesn't matter. Anybody who's going to invest the time to read that book deserves my time in terms of helping them to just debrief and process it, because it is a paradigm shattering. Derek Jensen considers it the most important book of the 20th century. Paul Ehrlich considers it the most important book of the 20th century. Wow. I mean, Paul Chafurka and I both consider it the most important book we've ever read in our lives. Connie does too, and a lot of other people do. So yeah, right. I would be honored to be a part of that conversation.
Yeah. Well, I propose something here. How about Sandy and I take this on, read this book, and have you back and have a fruitful discussion centered on Overshoot and this book? Would you love to do that?
That would be one of the highlights of my year, I guarantee it.
Oh,
I would love
that would be great.
But a lot of people, because it was written in 1980, a lot of people just assume that, it's outdated. And I assure you, there is virtually nothing in that book that's outdated. And even the foreword is written by Stuart Udall, who was the Interior Secretary under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And it is the most devastating critique of eco-modernism and techno-optimism. And it was written in 1980. It's on. Don't skip that forward.
No. Amazing.
All right, Jen, we're on. Michael, you're
Absolutely. This is
All
our
right.
challenge. And if we don't have time to read it, we'll just listen to your recordings, which are
Yeah,
so
there you go.
digestible.
Oh, yeah.
Well, cleaning the
Absolutely.
I have to say, you have such a lovely voice and your passion is infectious. And I have listened to some of the recordings that you've done, and they're very, very engaging and digestible. And that's the one thing I'd like to say. I think one of the reasons you're such an influential person on this space that we're on right now is because you have passion and you have knowledge and you have the inspiration to share all of this with people. So I think that's what makes you an incredibly influential person. You've got all of
thank you,
that.
Jennifer. That's a very, very generous sentiment. And I it's like I sometimes say, skunks just think by nature. Michael, this is just what Michael Dowd does. I mean, I get passionate about something. I become almost obsessive about studying it, learning as much as I can, and then sharing whatever I've learned, whatever forms.
That's a benefit to us out here.
Yeah, thanks. Well, yeah, anybody, if you're listening to this or watching this, if you just Google up on SoundCloud, just Michael Dowd, Grace Limits. It's Grace Limits is the name of sort of my SoundCloud, I don't know what it's called, channel or whatever, but if you just Google Michael Dowd, Grace Limits, you'll get all my playlists. Because I've recorded I think 9 of John Michael Greer's books and just a whole bunch of stuff.
Thank you.
Richard Heinberg. Whole bunch.
I think there'll be people in the audience that we are bringing in to a world that they may never have experienced. So this could be very pivotal for those that are watching that haven't been exposed, and that's great. That's a good thing, Michael.
Thanks. Well, the playlist that I recommend, I've got one called Post-Doom Soul Nourishment, which is a subset of a larger playlist that has about 100 different essays. They're not books, but essays, which is called R.I.P., Rest in Peace, Homo Colossus. And those two are the best collection of various essays, articles, not entire books. But if you just scroll down the Grace Limits playlist, you'll see, I've recorded, I think, 4 of William Ophuls, who's probably the single most significant person in the English language that brings the ecological paradigm to governance and politics. Like if we were to mimic the wisdom of ecology in terms of how we govern ourselves, our political order, what would it look like, sound like, feel like? And he's awesome. He's like, William Catton. Yeah. And one of my favorite people in terms of educating around abrupt climate change, which is something you all specialize in, is somebody you've had many times on, which is meteorologist Nick Humphrey. I took his 16-part series on the science of abrupt climate change, and I audio recorded all of them. Now, of course, he has wonderful charts, so I encourage people to actually look at his posts. But nonetheless, I wanted to make his work available to people in terms of understanding abrupt climate. And one other resource on abrupt climate change that if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend, and that is my hour-long conversation with Robert Hunsaker, and we titled it Abrupt Climate Change, the World Tour. And he took us around the world, region by region. And it's a great little primer on abrupt climate change.
It was, I listened to that one. It was just amazing. He's somebody I've asked if I could interview. And at the time he was very busy. They're always busy. But
he said no to me first, too. Well, I will say this about the Robert Hunsaker post-Doom conversation is that Connie spent 3 days adding tons of visuals that you won't get if you just listen to the audio. So anybody watching this or listening to this, you might want to check it out and actually make the time for the hour to watch that, because they're really helpful visuals that Connie adds to that particular conversation. One of the things about that I've recorded the audio of related to, not just authors of books and articles, but also I think I've got about 10 things that came out of Dark Mountain that Paul Kingsnorth and Dugald Hine wrote. And so that I've got a Dark Mountain playlist, and I've got a Jem Bendell playlist. So I've got a lot of stuff. So if people check that out, you'll see, and they're all freely available, obviously. So,
the Dark Mountain series is beautiful.
I wanted to ask you, Michael, what do you see as your ministry this year? What's your focus now? Yeah,
wow. I'm glad you asked that, because I'm actually going to be recording something tomorrow that will be my main evening program throughout 2021. I mean, what I'm doing in 2021 is for the first time in 19 years, we're settled in Ypsilanti, Michigan. We've got the cutest damn little apartment, which is actually the downstairs floor, the ground floor of an old historic house. We've got a huge, gorgeous big porch that overlooks the neighborhood. We've got the best porch in the neighborhood. And light comes in on all four sides. And it's just a little, 600 square foot place. It's like wonderful. But we love, love, love it. And we're 2 blocks from our granddaughter, 2 blocks from Depot Town, which is like the coolest, hippest part of Ypsilanti. And so the main thing that I'll be doing, in addition to what I've already shared, is that I will be scheduling Zoom sermons and Zoom homilies in liberal Christian churches and Unitarian churches around North America, the United States and Canada. And I'll do a 15, 20-minute Zoom sermon or homily, and then I'll send a link to this new program that I've been working on for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and that I'll be recording tomorrow. And what will happen was that the link will go out to the minister, it could be secular groups too, environmental groups, but the link will go out to the membership list. And then it will invite, on Thursday night, we're going to have an hour and a half Q&A with Michael on this topic. And so here's the program that you should watch in the next 5 days or whatever, and come with your questions, and we'll spend a full 90 minutes in a Q&A session with Michael on this topic. And the topic is, the title of my main evening program that I'll be recording tomorrow is The Big Picture: Clarity, Compassion, and Love in Action. The big picture: clarity, compassion, and love in action. And it has elements of I've got the 3-part series, the post-doom collapse and adaptation primer. It's got some elements of each of those. It's got some elements from my new Unstoppable Collapse video. So it's like, if I have 1 hour, if somebody's going to only experience 1 hour of what I've got to contribute to the world in the rest of their life, what would be what I would consider to be the best or most important stuff that I've been learning over the last 8 years in an hour-long session, or who knows, maybe it'll be an hour and 10 minutes or something. But so that's what I'll be doing throughout 2021, and I'm really looking forward to that, because it's got both the practical stuff as well as what we've been talking about, rise and fall, boom and bust civilization, so people can have that experience of, of course. They can have the experience of the blame game evaporating, and then they can get clear on where they can be a contribution and a blessing to their neighbors and their friends and their relatives and whatever, and support others in their life who are in the freak out mode, because we all have to do that.
Oh yeah, that's a pretty big. I would say the initial stage of post-doom is the freak out, when you realize, oh my God, what's happening here? It's all falling apart. And then you have to contend with it. Yeah, you don't get to post-doom. Right.
You don't really get to post-doom unless you go through doom. I mean, I sometimes think of doom. See, most people don't allow themselves to feel doom because they're afraid they're going to be in despair the rest of their life. They don't know that it's only the midpoint. They think it's the end. They think it's the destination, and they avoid it at all costs, understandably. But doom, I see, is the midpoint between denial and regeneration. The earth will regenerate with or without us. And so doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration with or without us. And when people get that, then they can see that door in the middle that says WASF. And of course, they know that means we are so, right? But then when they go through that door and look back, they can begin to see spheres of gratitude, spheres of contribution for the rest of their life. And then they look back and they see that same WASF over the door, but then they can feel we are so fortunate to be alive, to be conscious, and to be able to contribute to others who are still struggling. And there's a lot of people.
Michael. Yes. I before I forget this, the word doom, very controversial right now in a lot of circles. And Jennifer and I have been discussing this and grappling with this. And it's been out there that, casting aspersions on doomers or people who think like we are or have evolved to understand. Michael, I would like to know if you would like to comment on that, if you understand the negative connotation.
Very much so. Thank you. The first thing I want to say publicly, with between the two of you right here now and your watchers and listeners, is that I am a deep bow of honor and respect to those who have been in the doomosphere the longest. because these are the folks, you all know who you are, those who have been tracking on collapse, overshoot, decline of civilization, abrupt climate change, and so forth, who've been able to do that heart work, sometimes not getting to the place of post-doom because many people didn't even know there existed a continent called post-doom. They didn't know that possibility existed. They just thought that doom was all there is. Once you get it, it's like you sort of hang out in the doomosphere, and that's it. And in my experience, if you do that too long, you can easily become cynical and skeptical and sort of bitter, and understandably. But if you allow yourself to honor the doom and honor the doomers in your life, and don't judge them if you're no longer at that place, you realize they're in an essential place. But then coming to that place of post-doom, which it transcends and includes, it accepts doom, but ultimately comes to what can I think, what can I feel, and how can I be and act in the world that others experience as a fucking profound blessing.
Absolutely.
And that's the place of post-doom. It's the place of honoring doom, but ultimately being a contribution to the people in your life that you get to interact with, until the Grim Reaper comes from you, comes for you, and comes for all of us.
See, a lot of times, as we are the Rodney Dangerfield of the world, we don't get no respect. The doomers, we don't get no respect, and It is tough, because I think that the people that I've met in this whole sphere are the most enlightened, intelligent, caring, and compassionate people, and so I think it really we get a bad rap, and we're getting it now.
There are some conservative climate scientists that put us down for even investigating this and entertaining the idea that we might be WASF, right? And it is very frustrating to see that. Like Michael Mann has written a book recently, which I'm sure it's a very good book. I will read it at some point. I have it, where he actually has been putting the quote doomers down as delusional. And I was wondering if you would want to respond to that, and if you know what I'm talking about. Do you know what I'm talking about? I want to stick in the word doom porn, which greatly offends me. Yes. Really offends me. I'm sorry, but I have been all over Twitter saying that's offensive. We are brave. We are brave, courageous people willing to look at this, bald-faced in the face, and now we're getting put down. And I personally am offended.
You see so many narratives these days. It's sort of compelling, almost fictional narratives describing our portending doom. It sells. We call it climate doom porn. I think people who read it sort of almost provides adrenaline, the same adrenaline you get from watching an action disaster film. And so it's unfortunate that it's become so prevalent, because so many of these doomist narratives are based on a distortion of the science that's really as bad as the distortions of the science that we're used to seeing from climate change deniers. So it's bad science, claims that we're already committed to runaway warming and all of humanity will be wiped out within 10 years. And there are prominent actors in this space who make that specific claim. That potentially leads us down the same path of inaction as outright denial. If we don't believe there's any agency, if we don't believe we can do anything about the problem, then why bother? The science tells us that we can still prevent. If you would want to respond to that, and if you know what I'm talking about. Do you know?
I know very well what you're talking about. One of the colleagues that I value a lot is Jim Bendell. He and I talk offline, like not for public consumption, periodically, just to check in. And one of the last conversations we had was around Michael Mann's new book coming out that names him and others like us as, as doomers and sort of all of this negative language. And I just encouraged him in the most not urgent. I said, basically, Jim, you've got to realize that Michael Mann and others like him, the Bill Gates of the world, those who still believe that it's possible to technologically transform things. Connie, my wife, uses her arm and like in a downward like this. And she said, if you're up here and you still believe that it's possible, if we get enough millions of people to get on board, it's possible to transform the system, you're going to hate people down here and despise people down here who say it's inevitable or that we've already been in contraction and collapse for decades. And so I encouraged him at that time, and I encourage others, I certainly encourage the two of you, just love Michael Mann.
Okay.
Just the people who attack us are going to attack us. They can't help but attack us. There's no other option for them psychologically, because it's just too excruciatingly painful for them to realize that we're already in contraction and collapse. That's why I created that Unstoppable Collapse video. How to avoid the worst, and especially what I'm going to be focusing on in this new one that I'll be recording tomorrow, which is the big picture. Because I think to the degree that we who are already well in the doomosphere, and whether we call it doom or post-doom, it doesn't matter, but we really get all this negative stuff, including the very real possibility of near-term human extinction. To the degree that we can have generous hearts, genuinely love those people who are attacking us, we make it almost effortless when the time comes, which it will for all of them, including Michael Mann, including Bill Gates. The time will come when they begin to doubt. But then they won't have the stumbling block of us being nasty and back and sort of defensive and whatever, so that it will be much easier to come into a post-doom place if we've just been generous in our hearts.
And we have not been nasty, because we absolutely would not stoop down to that kind of level. Not on our
and it's painful to hear. I mean, it's painful for those of us who get the doomosphere and get abrupt climate change and get inevitability and actually ongoing collapse. It's hard to hear people such as Michael Mann and others who are basically claiming that we're no better than the fossil fuel industry.
I want to talk with you about a conversation that you had lately with Joanna Macy. And what is the thing that we can do to come to a place of inspired action?
Wow, thank you for that question, Jennifer. I think, well, one of the things that Joanna and I talked about was that what we both hold as two of the most helpful things for our own personal lives, and that we've shared with others, that she was one of my teachers in actually, is first an extended sense of self. A sense of self that is beyond what Alan Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, beyond the sense of self that my self stops with my skin. And it's that nested understanding, like Russian nesting dolls. I mean, I'm made up of, we all are made up of smaller, creative, intelligent beings, like our microbiome, that we don't exist without. And we're also dependent upon larger, creative, intelligent beings, trees, forests, Gaia as a whole, etc. So this nested sense of self is essential, because that's the greening of the self, the nested sense of self, that myself includes Gaia, it includes Nora. Nora is our personification. Connie and I have a playful personification for North America. So what most people call North America, we call Nora, and we imagine as a female personality. So we've got an intimate personal relationship to Nora. We've got an intimate personal relationship with Gaia. That's Gaia is the next nexting doll. An intimate personal relationship with the Milky Way and with the universe as a whole. And knowing that myself is all of those. And when I'm in touch with my great self, my green self, my earth self, my universe self, my Milky Way self, the fear of death evaporates. I have no fear of death. Whatever form or no form this being continues, I'm part of larger spheres of selfhood, of being, of reality. And so that larger sense of self, that sense of identity, this is what indigenous peoples both had a sense of relatedness, all my relations, to the world, to the living world, the biosphere, the ecosphere, but also they had a sense of intimate relationship with time. The reason that most indigenous cultures have no fear of death is because they know that when they die, they don't just die, they become an ancestor, and they are revered, and they are cherished, and they are consulted just in the same way that we consult our ancestors. So that sense of continuity with time, with the ancestors and with the descendants, I mean, that whole notion of acting in the present moment with the seventh generation in mind, that's not just a good idea. To do otherwise is evil. Because if we just allow our desires and wills and wishes and cravings and wants in the moment to lead us, rather than allowing imaginatively what would future generations, what would be best for them. So that sense of continuity with time, that identity with the past lives in us. Our DNA is the past living in us. Every atom of our bodies is made from stardust. That's the past living in us. And when we die, everything we do and say in our life is rippling out. So that sense of continuity with time, past and future, right relationship to the past, right relationship to the future, and right relationship to the body of life upon which we depend. And of course, that's not easy because we're part of an industrial system. We're part of economic and political and systems that are so ecological, that are so non-sustainable that we can't step outside of them. I mean, Thomas Berry used to famously say, I drove a car here to tell you how bad cars are. It's just part of the where we are.
We're all there.
But that sense of identity with time and space. So that's the first thing that can just evaporate the fear of death and allow us to live with even the possibility of near-term human extinction without being in freak out. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to understand and really get that death is natural, it's inevitable, and it's no less sacred than life. That death is essential in the universe. Connie and I, for years, like 12, 15 years, we did programs on a sacred science approach, like a meaningful, inspiring, science-based evidential approach to impermanence and especially death, mortality and death. And I've got stuff, if people go to our main website, thegreatstory.org, it's just www.thegreatstory.org, and just click on death programs. And you'll see we've got kids stuff, kids for adults, all kinds of stuff. Some great stuff on a way of holding the reality of impermanence and death that's not only accepting it, but genuinely celebrates the role of death in the universe. And that sense of identity, the expanding or the greening of the self, and that sense of not just peace with mortality, but recognizing, oh my God, we can't have a universe. You can't have a universe without the death of stars, without the death of plants, without the death of animals, without the death of cells in our own bodies. It's like my body, our bodies are always, the cells are dying, and then we continue to live. So that sense of identity and that sense of the sacredness of death are the two things, the two worldview shifts that help people move through doom to post-doom in the most elegant ways that I'm aware of.
Well, that was very eloquent and elegant.
Absolutely. And what's so great about that perspective is it doesn't compress. It's not a contraction. It's a continuity, and it's an expansion, and it's a continuation as well as being a continuity. And I think that just being in that space gets people out of the feeling of contraction and limitation and compression. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Right on the money. Stages of grief. You've got the normal Kubler-Ross stages of grief. And then Paul Czafurka talks about, from denial to anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. Well, on the other side of acceptance is finding the gift. And on the other side of finding the gift is gallows humor. And so one of the things when Connie and I are in conversation with people and they're talking about retirement or what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years, I'll whisper over to Connie. I'll say, yeah, unless we've all boiled like lobsters or starved to death by then. And it's just a way of keeping a little gallows humor.
Well, I definitely have to say I like gallows humor. I like all humor like that.
You have these big-hearted, often, Sandy, your laughter is so infectious. You've got this serious soberness of what you talk about, but there's a collegiality, there's a friendship, there's a sense of community that you've created on this channel that's notable. And so anyway, I just want to bow of respect to the two of you and to your team, because I think you're playing a vital role in this space.
I really like the idea that you reach out to others and that you make space for them to go through this process. And we're trying to do the same thing as well. So I think that we have a common sort of mission here.
I agree. And that's one of the reasons why I was looking forward to this call and am curious as to see how life, the universe, reality, God, goddess, however you want to call that reality, but whatever this nested reality is that we're all a part of, I'm curious to see how things unfold and in what ways we might, cross-fertilize or collaborate or whatever.
It's great. It's lifelong learning. And as an academic, it's lifelong.
And lifelong collegial friendships, and just seeing where those go. I want to share my creed, my faith statement in a nutshell. This is my eco-theo credo, because I'm an eco-theologian, right? So eco-theo credo. Because I would say that virtually every indigenous culture that we know of had an eco-theo worldview. That is, the ecos was divine, and the theos, the spirit world, was infused, embedded, embodied within the living world. So there was that sense of treating the living world as teacher, not tool, and as in a humble, respectful, responsible way. So this creed, this is my 6-part creed that I suggest actually probably unites tens of millions of people around the world, but it's certainly what accurately portrays my belief system. So, reality is my God. Evidence is my scripture. The epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. And fostering accountability or faithfulness to the future is my mission. So reality is my God. What I mean by that is reality is my ultimate concern, my ultimate commitment. That's what I mean by my God. That is my ultimate commitment. Evidence is my scripture, meaning evidence is the main way reality is revealing itself to us. Scientific, historic, cross-cultural, and intersubjective, subjective evidence. So reality is my God, evidence is my scripture. The epic of evolution, sometimes called Big History, or Connie's and my main website, is the great story. That what we mean is the story that includes all stories. So the epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. What I mean by that is integrity are the practices and exercises that help me live in right relationship to reality. So reality is my God, evidence is my scripture. The epic of evolution is my creation story. Ecology is my theology. Integrity is my spiritual path. And fostering faithfulness to the future, or accountability to the future, is my mission. And that really sums it up for me.
That's quite heavy and quite beautiful. And when I first read it,
very beautiful.
I know you've added it a bit since you first wrote it, but that's what came out to me. And the word reality and integrity.
And secular people won't feel comfortable with the God talk. Atheists don't feel comfortable with the God talk. They might say, reality is my ultimate commitment. Evidence is the way reality reveals itself, and so on. And more conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants may feel more comfortable, like, my God includes reality. My scripture includes evidence. My theology includes ecology. So there's different ways to word it, but I think that basic sentiment does unite many, many millions of us around the world.
And you've done a very good job of explaining that. Thank you. Jen?
Well, again, it's just been such a pleasure to talk with you, Michael, and I really look forward to our next conversation where we can dive into all things post-doom.
And William Catton's Overshoot. Oh, my goodness.
And the book.
Oh,
the Overshoot.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.